In 1942, the advertisement read, "Must be intelligent, have tact, and an adaptable nature. Luxury lovers or spoiled children need not apply. Age 21 to 35. Unmarried with your parents' permission, or married without children with your husband's permission. To join the Canadian Red Cross Corps Overseas Detachment." From 1943 to 1947, 641 women volunteered and served in the European theater of war. Volunteers wearing a red cross, whose primary desire was to be useful. Useful in a time of enormous need. This is their story.
The Dominion Parliament meeting in the historic Government House in Ottawa officially declares war for the first time in Canada's history as a separate Dominion.
I went to the movies one night and they were showing, the front, and there was something about if everybody does their bit, we'll get through this. And I said, I'm going to see what I can do.
I had to feel you want to do something, and the word patriotism doesn't sound so good nowadays, but that's what we felt, actually.
As Norway, France, and the Low Countries of Europe were lost to the Nazi blitzkrieg, and British troops were evacuated off the beaches at Dunkirk, suddenly, a vague concept of war became frighteningly real to most Canadians.
I don't think we really understood what war was all about until it got going for 6 months or a year. Then you began to lose friends.
It was during this period of despair and pessimism that the Canadian Red Cross Society formed the Canadian Red Cross Corps.
My father took me down to the office of the Red Cross, and on the form it said, do you want to go overseas? And of course I did. And when I came out and told my father I signed for overseas, his face went down.
I had a longing for adventure, and this would certainly provide adventure. And not least of all, I had a young man who was overseas with the paratroops, and I was very anxious to get to see him.
They anticipated that if their husbands were over there, or partners, or boyfriends, that they may well not see them for a very, very long time. So that was certainly an incentive for many of them to leave.
I met Guy, and we went out for a year. He asked me to marry him, and I said yes, and he said, but before I go away, and I said, sure. My father said, wait until he comes back. Wait until after the war. No, I won't. In 1941, I was married, and he went overseas in beginning of November.
Images of London burning horrified the Canadian public, and thousands did volunteer work for the Canadian Red Cross in support of the British civilian population. As Canada, Britain, and their allies frantically built their peacetime resources into a coordinated war machine, the women of the Canadian Red Cross Corps began the training that would one day enable them to go overseas.
Your uniform tells the world that you belong to the Canadian Red Cross Corps. You've had lectures on military law, drill for discipline and fitness, first aid, motor mechanics, the specialized training to fit you for your task.
These are both attractive women, but they're women with a purpose. They're serious women. These are not women playing games. And, of course, they had the tremendous advantage of being able to draw on a population of women who had not been able to marry, as many of them might have anticipated in the 1930s, hadn't been able to find the kinds of employments that their talents really merited, and who were looking for a challenge.
The Canadian Red Cross Corps was set up on a military model, divided into 4 divisions: transport, nurses' aid, or VADs, office administration, and food administration. Throughout 1941 and 1942, the women continued their rigorous training in Canada.
Marching. Oh, I mean, the army sergeant marched us around so that if we had a parade, we could march in it and know what to do and know how to get into a platoon.
We drilled three nights a week after work, like a 5:30 hour, 3 times a week. We got very military.
I was sort of a tomboy, and I liked driving, and we drove trucks, and as my friend said, we drove motorcycles, and we went through course for maintenance. We had to bleed brakes and get under cars, all kinds of weird things.
The changing a tire, really, I could do it in a minute and a half on an ambulance, you know.
In addition to their training, women hoping to go overseas were required to put in over 200 hours as volunteers in blood donor clinics, hospitals, and other war-related efforts. In August of 1942, Canadian troops sustained enormous casualties in an ill-conceived landing at Dieppe in German-occupied France. The reality of war truly struck home as the severe casualties returned to Canada.
There were at least 3 of us working in the Veterans Hospital, trying to put in our hours. And as you know, the Essex Scottish had taken part in the Dieppe raid, and we had quite a few injured who were returned. We all felt the first real shock when we saw them like this. It was walking into the ward, it was like being hit on the back of the neck, you know, this sort of thing.
In November of 1942, the Allied armies invaded Africa. And finally, the British Red Cross called for volunteers from Canada to help fill a shortage of support workers in England. It was then that the Canadian Red Cross Corps Overseas Detachment was formed.
I was dispatched to Eaton's and told to choose a fabric that they could supply us in uniforms in great quantity at a drop of a hat. Well, I really wanted gray. I thought gray was just great and nice and neutral. But he said, no, the only thing we can get anybody uniformed and send you overseas in by the end of December would be khaki. So hence our khaki uniform.
It was just a very exciting time for us to have an overseas posting. And I'll never forget the night I sewed my Canada flash on my arm and I had my Red Cross badge on my hat. Boy, was I proud.
On New Year's Eve, 1942, the first contingent of 18 women headed for Halifax and Pier 21 in preparation for crossing the submarine-infested Atlantic.
We landed at the harbor and we saw the Queen Mary and thought, oh boy, we're going over on the Queen Mary. And then down there somewhere was a tiny little ship.
The stateroom, they took out the one bed and put in 6 bunks, 3 on each side. So you're very close together.
We were 2 weeks at sea. I was dreadfully seasick the first day out. I thought if I could just get as far as the railing, I would end it all. But that didn't last.
This little ship, it would climb up the wave and scoot down the other side. The waves were that huge. And they said that that was normal for big storms on the North Atlantic. We were all, we were all sick. It was just, it was an experience in itself. I wanted to join Guy, quickly catch up. The last thing Guy said to me was, don't come to England. But anyway, he mellowed after a while. I went merrily off, finally, to England in 1943.
They loaded on TNT, but we waited outside the harbor in Sydney to pick up the cargo because the
captain of the ship felt our cargo was too explosive to go inside the harbor in case we got hit.
A man would come into our cabin and drop something down on the floor and come up, and I said, "What are you doing down there?" "Oh," he said, "we've got frozen food or something." And I said, "Okay." Then we discovered when we finally landed that it was ammunition. And thank goodness we didn't know.
We were under submarine attack for 72 hours. You could put your hand on the bulkhead, or whatever you call that, and you could feel the vibrations of the depth bombs around our convoy.
That age, you're relatively fearless. It never, I slept like a babe. You didn't sort of worry about what was going to happen. As far as you could see to the horizon, you could see those ships.
Well, there was a good bar on board. And we were all told to take flasks with us, you see. And of course, we drank those down the first night and promptly went and filled them up at the bar during the day. But I better not publish that.
We had a great time because there were 3 men and 3 women, and we used to play cards and dance, and we had good food. And that was the beginning of the fun side of the war.
Today, their memories are lighthearted, an easy crossing in a North Atlantic convoy. But to put it all in perspective, in 1942, Nazi U-boats sank over 1,600 Allied ships traveling in convoys. This crossing was a very dangerous crossing.
We were married in Toronto on the 4th of January 1940. My son was born in January 1941. Then when he went overseas, we talked about me coming. And he said, "I think it would be fine if you came. I feel the war is only going to last another year." So I went to a lawyer and had adoption papers made out. So my sister adopted my son just for the duration of the war. So now I was single, and I put my name on the list, and the adjutant and the commandant really wanted me to go, and they went up to Ottawa to push me ahead, and so I went quite quickly. Right after I sent the notice to my husband to say I was coming, he was killed. He never got the notice. And so my family wanted me to withdraw and not to go. I really didn't know what to do with my life anyway, and this was already planned. And so I went. I could not have gone if my son didn't have my mother to care for him, and my sister and my brother-in-law. And they absolutely adored him. I can't believe I did it. I mean, when I think of myself now, but you have to remember what it was like during the war. Everything, your whole life had changed and disappeared. You just did what was presented to you on a day-to-day basis. They told me that he would ask where his mother and dad were, and they'd say over there, meaning over in England across the ocean. And he said I would stand at the window and look.
Such an experience as last evening, turning my back on everything that means my very life and leaving it for who knows how long, was something I hope never to experience again. Don't feel sorry for me, because I realize it is something everyone should feel. It brings home like nothing else would, that the family and home one comes from is just the most important thing in life. So often we're apt to forget that. I perhaps seemed to leave you hurriedly and indifferently at the station, but I had to. More tears would have been fatal. All that I can say is that you both are wonderful. Through the whole of that grim process of you made me feel as though I was doing the right thing.
Summer's day, in everything that's light and gay, I'll always think of you. country lane. Wherever there's a cottage small beside a field of grain, there'll always be.
So this is England. Crumbs! I have claustrophobia for the wide open spaces. White tiled bathrooms, hygienic-looking kitchens, screens on windows, no kidding. It escapes me how all these millions of people can mill around in such unsanitary conditions and not cash in. I suppose they build up an immunization to filth from infancy, but still, the house we live in is 2 old Victorian houses joined at the ground floor and the top. Never have I seen such steep stairs. Imagine.
We arrived in Liverpool and we were put on a train to go to London, where we were then taken to a Red Cross headquarters and assigned accommodation for a couple of weeks so that we could be decided where we were going to be sent.
When we got on the train, we wondered where we were exactly. We knew we'd been in Manchester. We looked at the train and we saw Hovis on the platform, just Hovis. We said, oh, we're in Hovis. And the next station was Hovis. And then somebody said, it's bread. It was all the way along.
We were being taken to Core House, which is in Kensington. And I have 2 pictures of the house on the corner. This house is just, chopped in half. And that was the first thing we saw as we turned to come down our street.
People were sleeping in the tube, down below in the underground. That absolutely shook me. First time I saw that, I really realized that there was a war. The people were really bombed out.
Traffic lights and your cars had a little slit. Over the 2 lights, there was a little slit. And so you could see this little slit coming along and you knew that was a car.
As you know, our Canadian bikes had brakes on the pedals and not on the handlebars. And so I would be driving through Hyde Park with parcels in my hands, and the bobbies would be saying, "Put your hands on the brakes, miss." I said, "I don't have any."
The women of the Red Cross Corps Overseas Detachment had come to England to do a job. And what jobs they were. Unglamorous, exhausting, and often dangerous. In the last months of 1943, a handful of Red Cross women sailed for the war zone as the Canadian Army landed in Italy.
It was our second to last night, I guess, and we were having a dinner, sitting at the table. We were just about to have our dessert on the ship, and it was going to be a treat, apple pie. And all of a sudden, there was an awful crash, and the boat listed. And when we got up to go out of the dining room to go to our life stations, there wasn't any wall. We walked right through the dining room wall. It seemed to have been flattened out. We were walking over wood and whatnot. Anyway, we got up to our lifeboat station, and then we were lowered down on the lifeboat and taken to an American destroyer, and were hoisted up over the end by the seat of our pants. And after we'd sort of settled down, they said, "Well, we're going to give you some apple pie to eat. Good old American apple pie." And I said, "We didn't even miss our dessert."
As the Canadian Army began the long fight up the boot of Italy, the Red Cross women corresponded with POWs and their families and wrote countless letters for wounded soldiers.
Someone they could talk with, write their letters. Couldn't read or write, and there were a lot of them.
Just their presence of a Red Cross worker there, who could hold their hand and say, "You're going to be all right. Can I write a letter to your mother? Can I write a letter to your wife?" See, nurses didn't do that. Nurses were too darn busy.
But I'll never forget one time a lad asked me to write a letter, and anyway, we were awfully busy and tired, and I said, can I just leave it till the morning? And he said, "Oh, sure, sister." And I came back the next morning, and I looked up the number of the bed, and he wasn't there. And the patients all around looked at me. He died last night. And I'll never forget that. Don't put things off. I felt so awful. And I could feel it all the, the other patients were looking at me, and oh.
Those who remained in London were to endure heavy bombing and the deprivations of a city at war, while running Canadian servicemen's clubs, cooking for a never-ending stream of soldiers, making dozens of beds, staffing information desks to assist servicemen on leave, answering phones, delivering messages and crucial supplies. They oversaw 1,000 administrative details and kept careful records, receiving and distributing food and clothing to servicemen and civilians in need, and baby layouts for dependents of Canadian soldiers.
But they only got the coupons and the layouts if they proved paternity. So I had to read these letters. That was my job. One was particularly funny. This Canadian went to their house for leave each time, and he said, we treated him like family. And she said, not only did he get my daughter pregnant and me pregnant, but he stole our bicycle. They got their layouts.
The same thing happened with the nurses. The same thing happened in women's divisions of the Navy, Army, or Air Force. I think we only coped with 6 illicits, but we had to look after them as married women expecting a baby, you see. One lived in my residence, granted in the second half of the residence I lived in, and I didn't know until she was 7 months gone. You had to find out who was the father, sit him down in front of his own colonel and our colonel, and then everything calmed down, and she stayed there and had her baby there. After they had the baby, they had to go home.
War was raging, and it would one day leave its mark on the women. But at the time, they were young, resilient, and far away from their Canadian homes, many for the first time, in one of the most exciting cities in the world, London.
There are a lot of good plays and good musicals and so on. And sure, halfway through some of the performances, the sirens would go, some of the people would leave, but the actors never did. I never did.
It was exciting, and there were Canadian soldiers everywhere, and they were fabulous.
I didn't drink in those days, but I did like champagne, and I thought it was the nicest ginger ale I had ever tasted.
As you got to know people, there was always somebody who said, let's go to the pub.
Let me tell you that everyone goes to pubs. They aren't like the beer halls at home. They're gathering places. I had a glass of what they call shandy. It is half beer and half lemonade, but it tastes much like root beer. Not bitter or anything. In fact, quite good. I thought I had better tell you about this because I will probably be going again. I repeat, it is perfectly okay. One of the Red Cross girls I came with is English, and she assured me that the nicest people go in. If you're too upset, let me know and I won't do it anymore.
By May of 1944, over 200 women had been sent overseas to serve with the Canadian Red Cross Corps. And as spring began its ragged bloom in war-ravaged Europe, England held its breath, waiting for the dawn that would finally signal the beginning of the end. On June 6, 1944, the Allied armies, including over 21,000 Canadian men, landed on the beaches of Normandy in France. The British Red Cross, anticipating the enormous need to transport casualties, called for additional Canadian Red Cross Corps workers to serve as drivers and nurses' aides. On June 13, 1944, Hitler unleashed a new reign of terror on England when the first V1 unmanned bomb, or buzz bomb, fell on London.
That was unpredictable. You just heard this awful noise in the sky and you didn't know. And when the engine cut out, you would just wait and wait and wait, and then if it went over, it's not going to hit us this time. That's the way you lived.
We were supposed to go downstairs to the basement to our shelter. And I did for about 3 or 4 times. And when I kept finding I was the only one down there, I stopped. Nobody bothered.
I need a lot of sleep, so I didn't like having to go down there. And I just stayed in bed. And this night, there was a French door beside me, and the piece of shrapnel broke the glass. This is what wakened me, and then the thing landed on my feet. I was bombed out 3 times over there.
I was sitting in a pub once in Tilbury, and I ended underneath the table with my beer, which I hadn't spilt any. And a bomb hit the building next door, a buzz bomb.
In the 3 months between June 13th and September 7th, 1944, 9,521 buzz bombs were launched toward London.
I remember going to work one morning when the guards' chapel had been hit and all those very important officers had been killed. You know, they put the bodies were on the piled up like.
By July of 1944, casualties from the front lines of the war began arriving in England. Ambulances transported these wounded soldiers to nearby hospitals and hospital trains.
This was a British Army operation called AVAC, which meant the air evacuation of casualties.
We were each assigned our own ambulance, which we took care of and serviced and gassed up and looked after entirely ourselves.
Behold the working gal. We are hard at work maintaining the vehicles down here now, and what a job. When we came down Thursday, we hoped we would stay here for about 6 weeks. Now we hope it will be 6 days.
We would maybe go out at 7 o'clock at night and come back at 4 o'clock in the morning. We would maybe go out at 1 o'clock in the morning and come back at 7.
Then you had to get up and maintain your vehicle, clean the inside of the vehicle, clean everywhere on it. And you'd get perhaps a few hours fun with the other gals before the bell rang and you had to start off the whole thing all night long again.
There was a large board where our names would go on, and then as the top ones would go off on an assignment, the bottom ones would move up, and when you returned, of course, you go to the bottom of the board, and you just sort of hope that maybe you could get a night's sleep before you got called out again.
And I remember a feeling of absolute terror watching my name go down on the list and not knowing what kind of a trip I would have, whether I'd be alone, whether I'd be in the convoy. Terror.
Our living conditions were so extraordinary and so really difficult. They weren't easy. You never slept in the same bed 2 nights in a row. Your life was a mobile life.
Relatively untrained in first aid, they were nevertheless expected to single-handedly drive the vehicle, as well as deal with the needs of up to 5 patients in their ambulance, all under wartime conditions.
Well, I picked him up, and I drove him to the hospital, and they told me he was dead. They wouldn't take him. So I went to about 3 or 4 hospitals before I finally was able to unload him, shaking in my boots all the time.
Well, I think the most difficult part was driving in a blackout because, first of all, we weren't familiar with the roads, and all the signs had been removed, so we had really very little knowledge about where we were. And there was a large roundabout in the middle of Swindon that I seem to have gone around about 20 times a night trying to find the proper way out.
And you had to fill in a report when you got home. How many miles you'd been, where you'd been, and sometimes it was pretty difficult if you got a little lost. You had to fill in a few false miles.
We had one gal that, she came in one night just trembling, and I said, "What's wrong with you?" She said, "I nearly hit an elephant." And I said, "You couldn't hit an elephant on a British road, now come on, you know." And I took her off to sick bay, and I said, "I think you better stay there for the night." She stayed there, but about 3 hours later, another driver came in and said they'd seen an elephant on the road, and I thought, you know, there must be some poison in the local beer, because it couldn't be.
But there was an elephant on the road, escaped from a local zoo. A rare note of comedy as fall became winter, and the stream of shattered bodies continued to arrive unabated in England.
Heard the King's speech today at 3 p.m. and thought so hard of you, both sitting in the library, listening to it at 10 a.m. It is all so amazing. Little did I think last year as I sat at home that I would be hearing the King's speech in England this year. May I hear it at home again next year.
Soon drivers, welfare officers, and nurses' aides would receive their orders that would take them from England to the front lines of the war in France, Belgium, and Holland. In February of 1945, the Allies received the surrender of the German army in Italy and continued to push relentlessly towards a crossing of the Rhine as casualties continued to mount.
St. Dunstan's was a place in England. It was a rehabilitation place for service, war-blinded. There were all kinds of different casualties, emotionally and physically. My particular job was 5 days a week to teach hook drugs and string bags. And this sounds very basic, but it was the beginning of manual dexterity. We did a lot of social things. Anything at all in the evenings and on weekends that they would normally have done. And we were their escorts. If they wanted to talk to somebody, and if you were there, you were it, and you listened. Particularly Canadian men with Canadian women. They liked to hear our voices.
As the forward areas of the war were secured, a select group of Canadian Red Cross workers transferred to military operations in France, Belgium, and Holland.
Darlingest family. Well, we are finally on our way. At present, we are sitting at an embarkation point transit camp. Quite an experience. Actually, last Thursday, we started flapping. Great rush of packing and last-minute preparations. The definite word came on Saturday that we were leaving Charlton Park at 4 a.m. Monday. My reaction was nil. It's been such a long wait. And now I have become quietly ensconced in the English countryside and was quite happy.
We got on our landing ship tanks, and we had to drive like this and back up the ramps. And the fellows were saying, "Lady, I'll do it for you." And I said, "I know how to do it."
We ended up quite close to Ostend, up the coast a bit north, a place called Den Haan. Things the convoy did was to unload hospital trains that came down because the action had moved way, way up by that time.
We landed in Bayeux to begin with, and we sat there until Caen was liberated, and I was asked to work in the operating room because they were short-staffed, because we had 1,860 operations the first 10 days, 7 tables. I found that the boys who were burned were the most difficult to help or to relate to with a smile on your face.
It was a very small hospital on the coast, not very far from Dieppe, when I was the only Red Cross. and about, 12 doctors and nurses between us. And we're waiting for the announcement at the end of the war.
God bless you all. This is your victory. We have never seen a greater day than this.
Captain Donaldson went around from office to office and he said, "Come on, you're free for the rest of the day." Everybody, the office buildings, everything just emptied. It was nothing but people. People, people, people. And the lights. You see, the lights came on.
We went by tube to the Tower of London. And what a sight it was. All floodlit, looking like a setting in an opera. It's indescribably beautiful. All silver and black. We walked over Tower Bridge, the light glittering everywhere. A very different sight from the times I looked up and down the Thames, seeing nothing but vague, misty forms on the banks, and only streaks of searchlights in the sky. This sight I shall never forget. Black ruins all about for acres, and the great cathedral of St. Paul's all bathed in light, standing above it all, with a gold cross on top of the dome, gleaming. A breathtaking, unbelievable sight.
The reality in Europe was that peace was nothing but a word. Everywhere you looked, the suffering still continued.
That day, the convoy went out on a trip, and the Belgian people sort of stopped in their tracks and looked at us to realize that for some people the war wasn't really over, that ambulances were still working.
I felt a terrible sadness because all around me I could see the results, how it had changed lives.
One day in our office, I got a phone call, and the British Red Cross in a hospital were looking for a man who said his name was Dunnit, D-U-N-N-I-T. And my cousin's name was Cunning, C-U-N-N-I-N-G. He didn't show up when I felt he should have, when most of the prisoners of war were back. And all of a sudden, it hit me. A sick man would spell his name, perhaps, and a D would sound like a C and a T like a G. So I hopped on a train right away and went up to the hospital and walked in the ward, and it was my cousin on the bed. He was a big man, skin and bone, and he didn't know who he was or anything. He still thought he was back in a prisoner of war camp, but he did recognize me.
London began to fill with soldiers returning from the front, and every day young men and women resumed their romance, long postponed by war.
Mother, darling, I don't know what to write or where to begin. I'm in such a daze I can hardly write. I've just got back from 4 days' leave with David, my own dear David, who is more wonderful than ever. Sit down, dear. We are going to be married.
There was a sense of undoubtedly camaraderie for the young men and the young women. They were involved in a common enterprise. And you live passionately when the fear of not living at all is very immediate.
My roommate got married to an Army officer, and I was a bridesmaid. It was pretty exciting. And Simpson's sent a wedding dress and 2 bridesmaids' dresses, and it was gorgeous. And then it was used, I don't know how many times after that, a good many.
Of the 641 Canadian Red Cross women who served in Europe during the Second World War, 86 were married while overseas.
Sailing Sunday, Queen Elizabeth, docking New York, home via Montreal. Orders as they stand. terribly excited to think we'll see you all so soon. Love, Nancy.
The women of the Red Cross Corps were coming home, some escorting war brides and children of Canadian servicemen to their new homes in Canada.
It is quite a thing to come from your home, root up everything, leave your family, your friends, your cousins, and come to this strange country, which is huge.
Many are seasick. And how do you clean diapers? With salt water. How do you clean glass bottles? With salt water. Red Cross workers would board each ship before she would go overseas to bring the war brides back. And that's why they were there, was to help.
Ultimately, 48,000 war brides and 22,000 infants crossed the Atlantic under Red Cross escort.
I went to my CO at the hospital and I said, I haven't told you this before, but I have a little boy waiting for me at home and I'd like to be on the first boat going back.
It was quite an adjustment because your friends at home didn't know what you were talking about.
It was as though I'd been hit by a bomb when I got home. I couldn't even get on a streetcar and go downtown in Toronto and buy myself a blouse and come home. I just couldn't. There was too much of everything. Too much of everything. Too much plenty of everything.
As soon as I got home, I had a week's holiday, and then I was back at the university studying what I really wanted to do, and I think my parents took off for 3 months to become more adjusted to me than I was with coming home.
There was a great esprit de corps. Everybody stuck together and some wonderful friendships were made, and people who worked together and stayed together and still know each other.
In 1945, the first to return home formed the Overseas Club in order that they might remain in contact with each other and to continue to serve a greater good by raising money for those less fortunate than themselves. At the time this film was made, they had met every year for 55 years. And in those 55 years, raised over $230,000 for the Canadian Red Cross, and had a ball doing it.
Every minute of it was something that I treasured. I did what I liked doing, which was driving, and I made many friends, and I also met my husband.
You lost a lot of good friends, and that was the terrible part of it, the terrible destruction. But it's an experience that I'd hate to go through again. I'd hate anybody to go through again, but I wouldn't have missed it.
They served well, and they served in very dangerous areas. There was no more dangerous area than London. Think of the morale booster of a guy who landed in a Lancaster after it had been shot up. He was in a hospital in Worthing-on-Downs or something, and he comes to, and there's a Canadian Red Cross worker standing there.
The last of the 641 volunteers returned home to Canada in March of 1947. One woman had died while overseas of pleurisy. 8 women were sent home. The balance served honorably and well, laughing and loving, working to exhaustion, in dangerous places offering critical assistance, in calmer areas offering the invaluable support that only a friendly voice from home can bring. They found a courage in their hearts they had never dreamed they were capable of. And many of them found that one love that would sustain them for the rest of their lives. Women from every corner of Canada who for a few short years led remarkable lives.
There'll be bluebirds over the white cliffs of tomorrow. Just you wait and see. There'll be love and laughter and peace ever after tomorrow, when the world is free. The shepherd will tend his sheep, the valley will bloom again, and Jimmy will go to sleep in his own little room again. There'll be bluebirds over the white cliffs of Dover tomorrow. Just you wait and see.